The rain had not stopped for 3 weeks. It was a constant whispering presence against the great leaded glass windows of Blackwood Manor, a sound that had become as much a part of the house's atmosphere as the scent of beeswax and old stone. For Alara Vance, it was the sound of her own life, a steady, melancholic drumming that marked the passage of days without change, without sunlight. She was a ghost in this house of ghosts, a distant, twice-removed cousin of the late Duchess, brought to Blackwood on a wave of reluctant charity to serve as a companion and governess to the Duke's 2 young children. Her own parents, and the modest inheritance that might have secured her a different fate, were long gone, lost to a fever that had swept through her village years ago. Now her entire world was contained within the damp gray walls of the ducal estate, a world in which she was neither family nor servant, but an awkward, silent appendage to the household. Her days were measured by the needs of others. Mornings with 7-year-old Amelia, a child as silent and watchful as a small owl, and 10-year-old Thomas, whose boisterous energy seemed to have been extinguished by the oppressive grief that coated the manor like dust. Afternoons were spent mending, her needle stitching quiet, invisible repairs into the fabric of the household. Her evenings, when she was required to be present, were the worst. They were spent in the cavernous dining hall, a silent observer at the far end of a polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch for miles. Tonight was one such evening. The Duke, Alistair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, sat at the head of the table, a figure carved from shadow and sorrow. He had been handsome once, Alara supposed, judging by the portraits in the gallery, but grief had whittled him down, sharpening his cheekbones, hollowing his eyes, and encasing him in an impenetrable shell of cold civility. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low rustle, like dry leaves skittering across flagstones. The other occupants of the table were guests, neighbors drawn into the Duke's orbit by duty or ambition. And then there was Lord Cassian, the brother of the late Duchess. He was the opposite of the Duke in every way, florid, expansive, his voice a constant booming presence that filled the silence Alistair left behind. He had taken over the management of the estate's affairs, a role he performed with a great deal of noise, and Alara suspected very little substance. "The accounts are in excellent order, Alistair, excellent," Cassian declared, waving a dismissive hand as if swatting away a fly. "The tenants are content. The yields from the North Fields were spectacular this season. We've seen a net surplus of nearly £1,500 after the autumn sales." The Duke inclined his head, a flicker of something, weariness perhaps, in his dark eyes. He did not look at the papers Cassian had pushed toward him. He looked at the rain lashing against the window pane. "And the grain storage? The reserves for the tenants' winter allotment?" "Full to bursting," Cassian boomed, laughing. "We could withstand a siege. Nearly 4,000 bushels set aside, more than enough. You have nothing to worry about, my dear fellow. Nothing at all." A profound silence descended upon the table. It was a statement of fact, a number, and it hung in the air like a chandelier. But for Alara, it was not a chandelier. It was a stone, and it had dropped directly into the placid pool of her carefully maintained invisibility. For the past month, she had been using old estate ledgers, retrieved from a dusty shelf in the nursery, to help Thomas with his arithmetic. The boy struggled with abstract figures, but when the numbers were tied to bushels of wheat and acres of land, his land, they came alive for him. They had spent weeks poring over the very accounts Cassian was now summarizing so breezily. She felt a cold dread creep up her spine. The number was wrong. It was not a small error, a minor miscalculation. It was fundamentally, impossibly wrong. The ledgers she had studied, the real handwritten accounts from the estate manager, showed a reserve of barely half that amount. She could see the page in her mind's eye, the neat columns, the spidery script, the final tally circled in faded brown ink, 2,150 bushels. To speak was unthinkable. It was a breach of every rule, spoken and unspoken, that governed her existence. She was to be silent, to be invisible. Her opinion was not sought, her presence barely tolerated. To correct Lord Cassian, the Duke's own brother-in-law, in front of his guests, was social suicide. It was an act of such profound impertinence that she could not imagine the consequences. She would be dismissed, sent away with a pittance and a ruined reputation, a cautionary tale told by housekeepers for years to come. She lowered her eyes to her plate, to the perfectly arranged slice of venison she had no appetite for. She told herself to say nothing. It was not her affair. The numbers were just numbers. But then she thought of the tenant farmers, the families who depended on that grain. She thought of the estate manager, Mr. Finch, a stooped, honest man whose careful accounting was being casually misrepresented. And she thought of Thomas, the boy she was teaching, who was learning from those very ledgers that truth was found in diligence and accuracy. What was she teaching him if she allowed such a blatant falsehood to stand unchallenged? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She could feel the eyes of the other guests on her, not because they saw her, but because she was part of the scenery they ignored. She took a shallow breath. The words came out before she could stop them. Quiet, but clear, in the echoing silence. "Forgive me, your grace. My lord." Her voice was a thin thread of sound, but it cut through the room's thick atmosphere. Every head turned. For the first time in months, Ilara felt the full, weighted attention of the entire table. It was terrifying. Lord Cassian's jovial expression froze, then curdled into disbelief. "Did the mouse squeak?" he asked, looking around the table for support. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on the polished wood just in front of the Duke's plate. She could not bring herself to look at his face. "The number, my lord," she said, her voice steadier now, fueled by a strange, desperate courage. "The number for the grain reserve. I believe it is closer to 2,000 bushels, not 4. A collective intake of breath seemed to suck the very air from the room. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of grief or boredom. It was a sharp, crystalline silence, fraught with shock and disbelief. Cassian's face turned a dangerous shade of plum. "What did you say?" His voice was low, menacing. "You, a charity case, a glorified nursemaid, presume to correct me on the affairs of this estate?" Ilara flinched, the words striking her with physical force. She felt tears prick at the back of her eyes, but she forced them down. She had come this far. She would not retreat now. She finally lifted her gaze and met the Duke's eyes. They were not angry. They were dark, unreadable. But they were focused on her with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time, truly seen. "I have been using the estate ledgers to instruct Master Thomas in his mathematics," she explained, her voice gaining a sliver of confidence from his steady gaze. "The accounts from Mr. Finch, for the 3rd quarter. We reviewed them just this afternoon. The final tally for the winter grain reserve was 2,150 bushels. She had not just contradicted him, she had provided a source, a method, a verifiable fact. She had laid her integrity on the line. Cassian exploded. "The girl is addled, or worse, she is insolent, reading papers that are not her concern. Alistair, you cannot possibly entertain this madness. Dismiss her. Send her away at once." All eyes turned back to the Duke. He had not moved. His expression had not changed. He held the fate of her entire world in his still, silent hands. He let the silence stretch, letting Cassian's blustering rage hang in the air until it seemed to deflate under its own weight. Then, slowly, deliberately, Alistair turned his head to look at his brother-in-law. His voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. "Are you suggesting, Cassian, that the ledgers kept by my estate manager are incorrect? Cassian stammered, caught off guard. "No, of course not, but the girl must have misread them. She's a simpleton." "Miss Vance does not strike me as a simpleton," the Duke countered, his gaze sliding back to Alara. There was a flicker of something in their depths, something she could not name. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was not cold. It was interest. "She strikes me as someone who pays attention to details." He paused, and the weight of his next words fell upon the room like a judge's gavel. "And the difference between 2,000 and 4,000 bushels is not a detail. It is a discrepancy." He did not defend her. He did not condemn Cassian. He simply stated a logical truth, and in doing so, he shifted the entire dynamic of the room. He had taken her quiet, trembling words and given them the unassailable weight of his own authority. He had not agreed with her, but he had validated her right to speak. The rest of the dinner was a torturous affair. Conversation sputtered and died. Cassian sulked in furious silence, shooting daggers at Alara that she refused to meet. The guests, sensing a storm they wanted no part of, made their excuses and departed with unseemly haste as soon as the meal concluded. Alara escaped to her small, cold room under the eaves, her heart still a frantic drum against her ribs. She had expected dismissal. Instead, she had been handed a reprieve, a strange and unsettling validation from a man she barely knew. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the sound of the rain her only companion, and wondered if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or if, somehow, she had just taken the first step out of the shadows. The next morning, a summons arrived. A footman, his face a mask of professional neutrality, informed her that the Duke required her presence in his study. The study. It was the heart of the manor, a room she had never seen, the private sanctum of a man who prized his privacy above all else. This, she thought with a fresh wave of terror, was where the dismissal would finally happen, away from the prying eyes of guests. She smoothed the worn fabric of her gray dress, her only presentable one, and followed the footman through corridors that seemed to narrow with her every step. The study door was tall and imposing, made of dark, polished oak. The footman knocked, opened it, and announced her name before retreating, leaving her alone on the threshold. The room was not what she expected. It was not a place of cold, ducal authority. It was a room that was lived in. Books overflowed from shelves, stacked on tables and chairs. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the comfortable chaos. And in the center of it all, behind a massive desk, cluttered with papers, sat the Duke. He was not wearing his formal evening coat, but a simpler, darker jacket, and without the stiff formality of dinner, he looked younger, more approachable, and infinitely more weary. He gestured to a worn, leather chair opposite his desk. "Miss Vance, please, sit." She perched on the very edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and wood smoke, a scent she found immediately comforting despite her fear. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He leaned forward, his hands steepled on the desk, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Last night," he began, his voice low and serious, "you cited the third quarter ledgers from Mr. Finch." "Yes, Your Grace." "Show me," he commanded. It was not a request. For a moment she was confused. "Show you, Your Grace?" "The ledgers. The ones you used to teach my son. I want to see the entry you spoke of." Relief and confusion warred within her. He was not dismissing her. He was investigating. He was taking her claim seriously. "They are in the nursery, Your Grace. I can fetch them." "I will come with you," he said, rising from his chair in a single, fluid motion. The walk to the nursery was a silent, surreal procession. The Duke, the master of the house, following the invisible governess to the children's schoolroom. When they arrived, Amelia and Thomas were on the floor, building a lopsided tower of wooden blocks. They looked up, their eyes wide with astonishment at the sight of their father, a rare visitor in their domain. Alistair's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at his children. He offered them a small, sad smile before turning his attention back to Alara. She went to the bookshelf and retrieved the heavy, calfskin-bound ledger. It felt solid, real, a testament to the truth she had spoken. She laid it on the small table used for lessons and flipped through the brittle pages until she found the correct entry. She did not speak. She simply pointed. Her finger, small and trembling slightly, rested on the final sum, 2,150 bew. The Duke leaned over her, his shoulder nearly brushing hers. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. The proximity was unnerving, intimate. He studied the page for a long time, his eyes tracing the columns of figures, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not looking at the sum alone. He was reading the story it told, the story of harvests and wages, of repairs and tithes. He was seeing the work. Finally, he straightened up. He looked from the ledger to her, and for the first time she saw a clear, unadulterated emotion in his eyes. Respect. You were correct, he said simply. The words were plain, unadorned, but to Alara, they were a coronation. Mr. Finch's accounting is, as always, meticulous, and your memory of it is precise. He looked around the nursery, at the worn textbooks and the children's drawings tacked to the wall. This is how you spend your time, teaching my son from the realities of his own estate. He finds it more engaging than abstract sums, Your Grace, she murmured, feeling a blush creep up her neck. I imagine he does, the Duke said, a hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the shadows. He turned his attention back to the ledger, a new hardness entering his eyes. This raises a number of other more troubling questions. He closed the book with a soft thud. Lord Cassian has been overseeing the London accounts and the consolidated reports. He has been presenting me with summaries. He did not need to say more. The implication was clear. If Cassian was willing to invent 2,000 bushels of grain, what other fictions had he been spinning? Miss Vance, he said, his tone shifting. It was no longer the Duke addressing a subordinate. It was a man asking for help. I have been remiss. Since my wife's passing, I have allowed myself to become detached from the daily running of this estate. I have trusted others to do what I should have been doing myself. He gestured to the ledger. You seem to have a clearer grasp of the state of my affairs than I do, and a better head for figures than my brother-in-law. He paused, and Alara held her breath. I have a proposition for you, he continued. In the evenings, after the children are asleep, I would ask that you join me in my study. I am commissioning a full review of the estate accounts for the past 2 years. I require an assistant, someone with a sharp eye, a clear head, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. His eyes met hers, and the unspoken part of his offer was plain. He needed someone he could trust. Your duties to the children would remain your priority, of course. This would be an additional task. You would be compensated for your time. It was an extraordinary proposal. He was not just forgiving her, he was promoting her. He was inviting her into the very heart of his world, the one from which he had excluded everyone else. He was offering her a position of trust and responsibility, a purpose beyond mending and chaperoning. I would be honored, Your Grace, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And so began the season of the ledgers. Every evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Alara would make her way to the Duke's study. It became their secret space, a world unto itself, walled off from the rest of the cold, grieving manor. The ritual was always the same. She would knock softly, and he would call for her to enter. The fire would be lit, a decanter of brandy on a side table for him, and a pot of hot tea placed near her chair by a discreet servant who quickly learned the new routine. At first, their interactions were strictly professional. They spoke of crop yields, tenant leases, invoices for repairs, and shipping manifests. They sat on opposite sides of the great desk, a mountain of paper between them, the only sounds the scratch of her pen, the rustle of pages, and the quiet crackle of the fire. But as the weeks wore on, the space between them seemed to shrink. He began to see not just her competence, but her insight. She noticed patterns he had missed, small inconsistencies that pointed to larger problems. She questioned a recurringly high invoice from a London supplier, a series of land sales in a distant county that were recorded at well below market value. She was not just an accountant. She was a detective, patiently unearthing a story of neglect and, increasingly, of deliberate deceit. She, in turn, began to see the man behind the ducal coronet. She saw the way his shoulders slumped in exhaustion at the end of a long night. She saw the genuine concern in his eyes when they uncovered evidence of a tenant family being unfairly treated. She saw the flashes of his dry, understated wit when she made an observation that amused him. The Duke of Blackwood was a title. Alistair was a man burdened by grief and responsibility, a man who was slowly, tentatively beginning to re-engage with his own life. One evening, they were working late, examining a particularly convoluted set of accounts related to mining rights on the Welsh border. The numbers refused to align. Ilara, frowning in concentration, reached for a heavy leather-bound volume at the same moment he did. Their hands met. It was the briefest of contacts. His fingers, long and warm, brushed against the back of her hand. The touch was accidental, unintentional. Yet it sent a jolt through her that was as powerful as a lightning strike. The air in the room thickened, charged with a new and unspoken energy. They both froze, their hands hovering over the book. He pulled his hand back first, as if he had been burned. "My apologies," he murmured, his voice rough. "It is nothing," she whispered, her own hand retreating to the safety of her lap. But it was not nothing. It was everything. In that single fleeting moment, the professional barrier between them had dissolved, revealing the fragile human connection that had been quietly growing in the candlelight. After that night, something shifted. The desk no longer felt like a barrier, but a shared space. He moved her chair closer to his so they could look at the ledgers together. He started asking her questions that had nothing to do with accounts. He would point to a book on his shelf and ask if she had read it. They discovered a shared love for the Stoic philosophers and a mutual disdain for the frothy popular novels of the day. He began to talk about his wife, not in the hushed, pained tones of grief, but with a quiet, reflective sadness. He spoke of her love for the gardens, her laughter, the emptiness she had left behind. And Ilara, in turn, found herself telling him about her own parents, about the small cottage she had grown up in, about her love for numbers, a passion her father had encouraged. These were private confessions, whispered in the late-night quiet of the study, secrets that bound them together more tightly than any shared task. Lord Cassian, however, was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. He saw the change. He saw the closed study door, the new light of purpose in Ilara's eyes, the slow reawakening of the Duke, and he saw it all as a threat. He could no longer rely on blustering and charm. His attacks became more pointed, more cruel. At a small dinner party, he remarked loudly on how some people had a talent for insinuating themselves into positions far above their station. When Ilara appeared in a new dress, a simple dark blue wool purchased with the first of her new earnings, he commented that it was remarkable what a little bit of ducal favor could buy. Each barb was designed to remind her and everyone else of her place. She was the poor relation, the charity case. She did not belong. Ilara bore his insults with a quiet dignity that only seemed to infuriate him further. She had the Duke's trust, she had her work, she had the growing warmth in the study that felt more like home than any place she had ever known. Cassian's words were like stones thrown at a fortress. But Cassian was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are dangerous. He knew the audit was uncovering his mismanagement, his petty thefts that had, over time, amounted to a significant sum. He needed a crisis, a distraction, something to shift the blame and reassert his own perceived indispensability. The crisis came on a cold, windy night in late November. A fire. It started in the barn of the Northwood farm, one of the largest tenant farms on the estate. Fanned by the gale-force winds, the flames consumed the wooden structure with terrifying speed, taking with it the entire winter store of hay and, more devastatingly, the grain that was meant to see not just the Northwood family, but 3 neighboring families through the winter. By the time the Duke arrived, alerted by a frantic messenger, the barn was a roaring inferno against the night sky. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and panic. Alistair, his face grim and illuminated by the hellish orange light, immediately took charge, organizing bucket brigades, seeing to the safety of the livestock, and comforting the distraught tenant, a man named Miller. Ilara had come with him. She could not bear to stay behind, to wait uselessly at the manor. She moved through the chaos with a calm efficiency, organizing the women, bringing blankets and water, her mind already calculating the impact of the loss. The grain in that barn was part of the reserve, part of the real reserve of 2,000 bushels, not Cassian's imaginary 4,000. In the cold, harsh light of the following day, the full extent of the disaster became clear. The barn was a smoldering ruin. 4 families faced the winter with no food for their livestock and no grain for their bread. The disaster exposed the razor-thin margins on which the estate was truly running. There was no vast surplus. There were no bursting storehouses. There was only what was in the ledgers, and a significant portion of that was now ash. The Duke called an immediate meeting in the study. Mr. Finch was there, his face etched with worry. And Lord Cassian was there, his expression a mask of solicitous concern that did not quite reach his eyes. "A terrible tragedy," Cassian began, shaking his head. "Terrible. But thank heavens for our foresight, Alistair. With the 4,000 bushels we have in reserve, replacing Miller's stock will be a simple matter." The lie was so bald, so audacious, that for a moment no one spoke. Alistair stared at his brother-in-law, his face a granite mask. It was Ilara who broke the silence. She had been standing by the window, but now she stepped forward, a single sheet of paper in her hand. "My lord," she said, her voice clear and steady, "there are not 4,000 bushels. After this fire, the total remaining reserve for the entire estate is just over 1,700 bushels. It is not enough to cover the winter allotment for all the tenants, let alone this additional loss." Cassian rounded on her, his face contorted with rage. "You! This is your fault! Meddling with things you do not understand! You have filled his head with these pessimistic fantasies!" He turned to the Duke. "Alistair, this is what comes of listening to an ambitious little nobody. She has panicked you, tied your hands with her ridiculous figures while I have been trying to maintain confidence." "The figures are not ridiculous, Cassian," Alistair said, his voice like ice. "They are the truth, a truth I have neglected for too long." He gestured to a stack of papers on his desk, the product of weeks of work with Ilara. "Miss Vance's analysis has uncovered more than just a discrepancy in grain. It has uncovered a pattern of fraud." He began to read from the top sheet, his voice cold and dispassionate. He listed the undervalued land sales, the inflated invoices, the funds diverted to a London bank account in Cassian's name. It was a systematic plundering of the estate, masked by charm and fraudulent summaries. The fire was not the cause of the crisis. It had merely illuminated it. Cassian's face went white. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a pasty, mottled gray. He was trapped, exposed, and so he did the only thing he could. He lashed out, not at the Duke, but at the person he blamed for his downfall. "He will not listen to you when he knows what you are," Cassian shrieked, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "Do you think she did this out of loyalty? Out of integrity? She is a viper you welcomed into your home. She has been in your study, alone with you, night after night. She has seduced you, clouded your judgment. She is your whore, and she has done all this to ruin me and take my place at your side." The accusation, so vile and so public, struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The air left her lungs. The room swam before her eyes. This was the ultimate humiliation, the ruin she had feared from the very beginning. She had offered her mind, her integrity, and in return she was being branded a courtesan. She saw the shocked face of Mr. Finch, the way he suddenly could not meet her eyes. In this world, a woman's reputation was her only currency, and Cassian had just declared her bankrupt. She looked at Alistair, her heart shattering. She saw the fury in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He would defend her honor, she knew. He would challenge Cassian, perhaps even strike him. But it would not matter. The poison had been released. The rumor would spread. The stain would remain. Her good name and the quiet, precious thing that had been growing between them was destroyed. But Alistair did not strike him. He did something far more devastating. He took a deep breath, the fury in his eyes banking into a cold, hard resolve. He walked around his desk until he was standing not in front of Alara but beside her. He did not look at Cassian. He looked at Mr. Finch. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice ringing with an authority he had not used in years. "You have served this family for 40 years. You know the difference between truth and slander. I am convening a formal meeting of the estate trustees and our primary tenants tomorrow morning in the Great Hall. I want you to be there." He then turned to Cassian, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "You will be there as well. You will have the opportunity to repeat your accusations then, in front of everyone." Then he did something that stunned the room into absolute silence. He reached out and took Alara's hand. His grip was firm, steady, a warm anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions. It was not the brief, accidental touch of the library. This was a deliberate public declaration. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice softening as he spoke to her, though it was loud enough for the others to hear, "has demonstrated more loyalty, more intelligence, and more integrity in 3 months than you have shown in 3 years, Cassian. She has not sought to cloud my judgment. She has sought to clear it. She has not worked for personal gain, but for the good of this estate and its people. She has done this not by seduction, but by diligence, by honesty, by sheer, unwavering competence." He turned, still holding her hand, and faced his brother-in-law fully. "You call her my whore. You are mistaken. I can only pray that one day she will do me the great honor of becoming my wife." The declaration hung in the air, more shocking than any of Cassian's accusations. It was not a defense. It was a complete reframing of the universe. It was a choice. A public, definitive, and irrevocable choice. He had not just defended her from a lie, he had elevated her with the most profound truth he could offer. Cassian stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of utter defeat. The weapon he had tried to use against her had been turned back on him with devastating force. He had tried to ruin her with a scandalous label, and the Duke had answered by offering her the most honorable title in his power. There was no response. There was nothing left to say. He had lost. The meeting the next morning was a formality. Cassian, broken and humiliated, did not even attend. He had packed his bags and fled in the night, leaving behind a trail of debt and disgrace. The Duke, with Elara quietly at his side, laid out the truth of the estate's finances to the trustees and tenants. He did not spare himself, admitting his own neglect and paying tribute to the person who had brought the truth to light. He presented Elara's ledgers, her analysis, not as the work of a lover, but as the work of a brilliant and trusted partner. The tenants, seeing her quiet competence and the Duke's unwavering public support, saw not an upstart, but a savior. The crisis of the fire was met not with panic, but with a new shared sense of purpose. A plan was made, sacrifices were shared, and the work of rebuilding began on a foundation of honesty. That evening, the manor was quieter than it had been in years. The storm of the crisis had passed, leaving behind a strange and hopeful calm. The rain had finally stopped. Elara stood in the study, looking out the window at the gardens, where the first pale moonlight in weeks was silvering the wet leaves. She heard him enter the room behind her. He did not speak for a long time. She felt his presence, a warm, solid weight in the quiet room. "What you said today," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes still on the garden. "In front of Mr. Finch and Lord Cassian." "I meant every word," he said, coming to stand beside her. He was close, but not touching. "Though I fear the timing and the audience were less than ideal. A man should not propose to a woman for the first time as a way to win an argument." A small smile touched her lips. "No, I suppose he should not." "Then allow me to try again," he said, and his voice was raw with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He turned her gently to face him, his hands taking hers. His eyes, so often filled with sorrow or concentration, were now clear and filled with a light that was all for her. "Elara," he said, using her given name for the first time. It sounded like a prayer on his lips. "I have spent the last 3 years in a cold, gray world of my own making. I was drowning in grief, and I had forgotten how to live. You came into my house like a ghost, silent and overlooked, and you brought it back to life. Not with grand gestures or loud pronouncements, but with quiet competence, with unwavering integrity. You taught my children, you balanced my books, you saw the truth, and you were brave enough to speak it." He lifted one of her hands and pressed a kiss to the back of it, a gesture of such profound tenderness it made her heart ache. "I am not offering you a title. I am not offering you this house or its riches. They are yours already, in a way, for you have done more to save them than I have. I am offering you my hand, my name, and my heart, which you seem to have claimed without even trying. I am asking you to be my partner. In all things. To argue with me over ledgers. To walk with me in the gardens, to help me raise my children. To share the silence and to fill it with conversation. Elara Vance, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or humiliation. They were tears of a joy so profound it felt like sunlight spreading through her soul. She had been seen. She had been valued not for a pretty face or a family connection, but for her mind, her character, herself. He was not rescuing her. He was choosing her. "You once told me," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that I did not strike you as a simpleton." A true warm smile broke across his face. "It remains the most astute observation I have ever made." "And you, Alistair," she said, her voice growing strong, "do not strike me as a man who makes idle proposals." She squeezed his hands, her choice as clear and as certain as a line of figures in a well-kept ledger. "Yes, I will marry you." 1 year later, the gardens of Blackwood Manor were in full bloom. The late Duchess had loved roses, and under Elara's patient direction, the neglected, thorny bushes had been pruned, fed, and coaxed back into a riot of color and fragrance. The scent of them filled the warm afternoon air. The manor itself felt different. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the sound of children's laughter echoing from the lawns, the murmur of contented staff, the quiet hum of a great house brought back into balance. The rain-streaked windows had been cleaned, and sunlight now streamed into the corridors, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden air. It was no longer a house of ghosts. It was a home. Ilara, now the Duchess of Blackwood, sat on a stone bench, a book open but unread in her lap. She wore a simple dress of pale green linen, the color of new leaves. A wedding band of plain gold sat warm on her finger, a comfortable weight. She was not watching the children, who were engaged in a spirited game of tag with their father on the great lawn. She was simply absorbing the peace of the moment, the quiet hum of a life she had never dared to imagine. Alistair, laughing as Amelia dodged his grasp, caught her eye. He paused, his face flushed with exertion and happiness, and gave her a smile that was just for her. It was a look that spoke of shared nights in the study, of whispered conversations, of a partnership forged in ink and fire and solidified in love. It was a look of profound gratitude. She smiled back, a deep, contented warmth spreading through her chest. Her journey here had not been a fairy tale. There had been no magic wand, no fairy godmother. Her transformation had been wrought not by enchantment, but by arithmetic, by honesty, by the quiet courage to speak a simple, inconvenient truth in a room full of powerful people. The world valued titles, beauty, and wealth. It overlooked the quiet competence of a woman in a gray dress. But here, in this place she had remade, her worth had been recognized and celebrated. She had not changed who she was to become a duchess. She had become a duchess because of who she was. The real victory was not the title, or the house, or even the defeat of a man like Cassian. It was in the small, unwatched moments, the way Thomas now explained sums to his sister with patient clarity. The gratitude in the eyes of the tenant farmer, Miller, whose new, well-built barn stood as a testament to shared effort. The comfortable weight of Alistair's hand in hers as they walked the grounds in the evening, discussing the day. It was the triumph of substance over performance, of integrity over influence. It was the simple, unassailable truth that a person's value is not measured by their station, but by the quiet, steady work of their head and their heart. A truth as solid and enduring as the stone of the house itself,